Hi, thanks for having me here this evening. This session is going to be all about the new announcements that we've had with SharePoint and Office 365 that's come out of the Microsoft Ignite conference. So I was over in attendance for the Microsoft Ignite conference. It was towards the end of September, last week of September, and it's the largest conference that Microsoft has when they deliver SharePoint news. So we see it at the same time each year. They do it at the end of September, and that's the biggest release of news we will see for 12 months when it comes to SharePoint. We see a refresh in May of each year, but that is a smaller announcement, so that'll come around in May. But this is where they'll lay out their roadmap. They sort of educate us into what has been released in the sort of within the last year, give us a quick refresh, and then they'll tell us where their vision is, where they're going, and what we can expect to land in that next 6 to 12 month period. The Microsoft Ignite conference is more than just SharePoint news. It is all of the services that are in Office 365, and it's also some of the related technologies. There's some information there about Azure, about identity, about your Office products, Yammer, Stream, quite a lot of the other products that go with SharePoint and around the SharePoint technologies. So what I've done is, in this session, I'm really bringing out all the news and announcements that are around SharePoint, if that's your interest, if that's your topic of interest, pulling all the information out that's SharePoint related. And that event went for 5 days, and there was over 700 sessions on different technologies and different topics. Of those, there was over 100 sessions that were just SharePoint related topics coming out. So this is a real whirlwind tour of all the end user features and functionality that was announced. So I'm steering clear of any developer specific topics and any heavy sort of IT pro stuff. So this is more end user experiences and where Microsoft's going and what they've been announcing in that space. So a quick intro of who I am and why I'm standing up in front of you. I am Cameron Dwyer. I'm based in Sydney, Australia. I work for an ISV and we develop software and have done for the past decade around Microsoft Office, around Office 365 and around SharePoint. I'm also a Microsoft MVP in Office development, and so I have a fairly big interest and passion in this area, and it's also something that I'm working in day to day. So before we start diving into the actual features and functionality and going through those, I really just want to set the scene as what I saw as sort of the high level visionary things, or the strategic things that I saw that was coming out of these announcements and where Microsoft was heading, because I think that sets the scene for a lot of the individual features that we were seeing. And really, one of those things that came out was around Microsoft acting more as one company. Now we saw this, we had SharePoint as a product, an individual product, and many of us were in that space using SharePoint, and we saw SharePoint as a product. Then with the movement to the cloud, Office 365 became a thing, and then we were seeing some more uniformity around all of the products that made up that Office suite. We were starting to see product teams talk together and work together, and we started seeing things like the UI design and things like that were starting to become more uniform across the product suite. Well, what we're seeing now is Microsoft is not just talking Office 365. The terminology they're now using is Microsoft 365. And what we're talking about here is not just bringing together the product groups within the Office stack, but it's bringing together all of Microsoft. And some of these strategic things that they're doing are plays across the entire company. And I think the first time that we're seeing this was, well, we explored a lot around the identity, the user's identity, and making sure that we knew who a user was across all of the different products and the operating systems themselves. But a lot of that was behind the scenes. This time, what Microsoft was seeing, what we're seeing a lot of at this conference, was Microsoft presenting a new modern user interface across all of Microsoft. Right from the operating system being Windows 10, SharePoint, Office products, clients on mobile devices, but it was uniform. So I'm going to play a video here at the start that sort of, I think, delivers that message of Microsoft all up. And some of the things you'll see in this video, I'll be going into deeper as we get into the talk. So I'll be quiet for a little second, and we'll let this roll. Okay, so as we went through that video, I guess there's a few things I wanted to point out there. Obviously, it's a very polished marketing video that's come out, but the message that comes across there and some of the wording that came up on some of those slides was, it's a new Microsoft. The video, the UI that we were seeing and what we were being presented isn't coming from any one product team. It's coming from Microsoft as a company. And what we were presented with there was a user interface, which they're terming fluent, but we were seeing it in Windows 10, we were seeing it in different browsers, we were seeing the desktop Office clients, we were seeing SharePoint, we were seeing the Bing search experience. So we're really seeing all of the different product teams all coming together and implementing one coherent user interface and design, which was good. And I think that leads into, now if we segue into SharePoint, I think one of the things that Microsoft is really trying to do, and has been trying to do for a while, is change the perception of the look and feel of SharePoint. For a while, SharePoint has been seen as being a bit ugly. And Microsoft is really trying to put the spin that SharePoint is beautiful again. And we've been seeing this movement over the last 12 months, maybe even more than 12 months, in that we've been seeing that we've got what we're calling classic SharePoint, and we're seeing modern SharePoint. So these modern experiences inside of SharePoint that they're really starting to use modern web technologies. They're following modern standards. We're getting pages that look nice across devices. They'll react to the devices that they're on. They're responsive as far as interaction goes. And they're what people expect from modern sites these days. But at the moment, SharePoint is still stuck in this land where on the one site or the one SharePoint environment, you've got this mix of some pages are still in a classic sort of mode, and some pages you're seeing in modern. Up until this point in time, it's been more the content publishing, the ECM side of things, where you're actually authoring the web content. That's where most of the effort has been put in modernising SharePoint. And the document management side of things, where most of your information workers are, and authoring Word documents, PowerPoint files, the management of that sort of side of things, that's been a bit slower to catch up. So a lot of announcements that we were seeing at this conference were all around making SharePoint beautiful again and bringing more of SharePoint from the classic world into the modern world. And that's what a lot of what the announcements are that I'll go through tonight. One thing that Microsoft also did, and this is the first time I've seen them do this, so I think to me this told me the importance they're putting on trying to change the perception of SharePoint in the marketplace, that it is beautiful and you should take another look at it. And they released something called the Lookbook. They actually stood up a website, which is, I've got on the slides here. The website that they stood up was all around what they're trying to achieve with the new design guidelines that they're putting together and the new features and functionality that they're putting into the UI of SharePoint. They've put this site together to, I guess, show what they're doing, but also the theory behind why they're doing it. And the lookbook itself is I think it's an 18-page PDF, and it's kind of like a brag book. It is really layouts of all different websites that have all been created using, or are all, SharePoint is capable of doing all these different types of sites. And they've done very sort of sparsely populated product sites that all look very clean and like there's lots of white space around them. And then they've done very dense ones with social media feeds and all sorts of things in them. So they've really just gone out of their way to put a nice polished PDF together to say, hey, look, does any of this look good to you? Does any of these resonate with what you're trying to achieve? Because this is all now possible with SharePoint. Okay, I'm going to dive in now for the bulk of this presentation. I'm going to dive in and we're going to have a look feature by feature, and we're just going to go through them in categories. So the first category I'm going to look at is hub sites. Now this is relatively new in the SharePoint world. It has been, while we've been transitioning from classic to modern, Microsoft has changed the guidance on how we do our information architecture. The previous guidance when we were doing information architecture was we had site collections at the highest level, and then we had sites and subsites, and this is how we'd sort of structure, if we were modelling an organisation, we might have the divisions and then sort of teams within the divisions, and they would break down into smaller sites. And then within those sites, we'd have document libraries and document sets, and we'd handle our information architecture in that way. What Microsoft is now changing that guidance to under modern SharePoint is to keep your site structure as flat as possible. right to the point where every site that you're creating should itself be a team site. So we're now finding that all of these sites are sitting all up at a flat level. But that brought about the need, well, how do we bring structure to that? Because surely if things are flat, then people aren't going to be able to navigate it. How do we bring things together and form some sort of hierarchy, some sort of navigation to it? Now, there's a few ways that they're proposing to do that, and the first of those is what's called a hub site. So a hub site is itself a site that, again, would sit at this flat structure up at the highest level, so it would be a site collection in itself, and you can turn a site collection into a hub site. And what that means is once it becomes a hub site, it gets the ability that sub-sites can be joined to the hub. And that then drives some navigation on the hub site, and it allows certain pieces of information to be rolled up from the hub site from the sites that are underneath the hub. Now, at this point in time, you can't nest hubs. You've only got that one level of layering underneath the hub. But that's a way that we can bring structure to it. And the main reason Microsoft is pushing this new structure for is the ability to reorganize SharePoint and be agile with your information architecture. In classic SharePoint, where we would have a deeper level of site structure, let's say we had a department for finance and we had a team site underneath finance, and we had another site collection for legal. Now, we decided to restructure the business, and all of a sudden it didn't make sense for that team to be under finance anymore. It really should be under the legal area, so it should be in a different branch. Picking a sub-site up out of SharePoint and moving it somewhere else was something that wasn't very easy to do, because there's a lot of things that were getting inherited down. We've got permissions, it could be content types, it could be design artifacts, it could be referencing other information that's on the site. It was actually quite difficult to achieve that sort of restructure. Your easier way to go would be to recreate it and move the content across, and you're looking at manual migrations. Correlate that to what we would be doing under this modern guidance, which would be that team site would be created as a site collection. We would also have site collections for the different departments, and those would act as the hub sites. Now, we would join our team when we provisioned it as a site. We would join it. Initially, it would have been joined to our finance hub. And when we decided to do the restructure, all we would be doing is disassociating it with the finance hub and associating it with the legal hub. That would achieve a restructure, because you're not physically restructuring it, you're virtually restructuring it, because your structure is only a virtual thing. It's not this top-down, deep information architecture that we used to have. So that's one of the main reasons Microsoft is pushing that. But those of you that have worked in sort of architecting solutions would see that there's going to be some drawbacks to that. We got some great benefits in being able to have that deeper hierarchy, and some of those are that cascading nature. We were able to do some things at a site collection level that would come down into the sub-sites. We could push branding down, we could push design down. There were certain shared elements. We had the concept of galleries that existed at the site collection level. Now, if everything is in itself a site collection, then how do we achieve these things? Now, a lot of the announcements that you'll hear now, what we're seeing is that Microsoft is starting to push some of those things that we were doing at a site collection level up into tenant administration. We have a new SharePoint central admin site, and Microsoft is announcing functionality, and you can see on the roadmap more and more of those types of items where we'll be seeing it and managing it up at a tenancy level and pushing it across site collections. So the announcements around hub sites, there's a bit of a background on what hub sites are and their purpose, but those in themselves existed before the Microsoft Ignite conference. So here's some of the news that did come from the conference itself. So the ability to associate a site directly from the hub. So the way that we used to do this, and it was a little bit clunky before some of these announcements, is to actually create a hub site in the first place. You'd create a site collection, as you normally would in SharePoint. There's no difference to it. Then you'd have to run some PowerShell to turn it into a hub. Once you've turned it into a hub, you could go into any of your other SharePoint site collections, and inside of the properties for it, you could join it to a hub, and you would get a list of your hubs and you join it. That association process now, directly from the hub site, you can click create a new site, it will create the new site collection and it'll automatically make the association for you. The next thing that they announced was that there's an approval process around associating that site to the hub. So you can imagine Contoso's created this beautiful looking hub site, and they've got all their corporate sort of sites joined to that hub. I could just come along and create Cam's Team Site 101 and join it to the hub, and there would be nothing stopping me from doing that, and you know, it would bugger up Contoso's hub site. So now they've put an approval process around that. So I can still request to join a hub, but the owner of the hub would be responsible for approving that request. There was also a limit on the number of hub sites that you could have at a SharePoint tenant, and that was at 50 hub sites, and they've upped that to 100 now. As I was saying, there's a new SharePoint Admin Center. Again, this thing's been existing for quite some time. It's been in preview for many, many months, so some of you might have seen this. But what was announced is some features are specifically around hub sites. So I just went through that process, explained that process of how we used to create a hub site was to just create a normal site collection and then run some PowerShell script to turn it into a hub site. We can now do that without any PowerShell script just by going to SharePoint Admin Center, and that drop-down menu that's a bit hard to make out on these screens from that distance, sorry, but I'll talk you through all these slides. So this one on the drop-down menu there, that says hub sites, and I can convert to a hub site. So I can just select any site collection and say I want to convert this to a hub site. It's as simple as that. The other button, the other option in that drop-down menu is to associate with a hub site. So I can select sites, other sites, and say I want to associate these to a hub site, select the hub site, and that does the association for me. So you can really manage all those hub sites associations from within the SharePoint Admin Center. And there's also a column there that I've highlighted that tells you what hub site a site is associated with, if it's associated to any. So it's giving us visibility and reporting across that. Another thing that was announced was that the events, an event web part is something that you can have in your different site collections. You have your calendars, you create events and everything, and they surface on the site itself. Once you join a site to a hub, those events then roll up to the hub that you've joined it to. So even though these sites are all separate, they don't sit underneath each other, once you join them or associate them to a hub, the web part, the event roll-up web part inside of the hub has the knowledge of all the sites that have been associated with it, and it will roll up all of the events from those sites that have been joined to it. The news web part already had this functionality before the conference. They announced it for the events web part. So now they are the two web parts that will support it out of the box at the moment on your hub site. So you get news roll-ups and event roll-ups. Okay, that's about it for hub sites, and I'm going to move on to, well, there's going to be two sections here. I'm splitting it into communication sites. So under modern SharePoint, there's really only two base type of sites that you can create. One is a communication site, and this is your intranets or your portals. It's where you're authoring web content. People are going in and creating pages for consumption. Typically, it's produced by a few and consumed by masses. It's things like your news, your portals, your intranets, where you're trying to disseminate information. So that's communication sites. The other type of site that we have is a team site. And this is the one that typically contains your document libraries. It's where your information workers are going in and they're creating files, contents. They're working in the business day to day. So they're your team sites. So this section of news is going to cover those communication sites, which is more that page authoring and producing information. So the first thing I'll talk about is news. So as I said, the news already had the capability of rolling up to your hub site. So you can have news down in all of the child sites, and it'll roll up into the hub. What they also announced was the ability to bring external sources in for your news. So before that, your news you would have to author inside of SharePoint itself. You would create the content of your news item, and that's what you'd be showing. What they announced was the ability to have a news link, which is basically just a URL to something that exists somewhere else out there publicly available. And that item would then get pulled in. It would still surface itself in much the same way. You'd still get the little thumbnail of it, you would get a description of it and the title, but when you actually drill through to the news, it's hosted externally. There was also the concept of organisational news. So while these roll-up web parts are pulling in news from different sources, you could designate a source as being organisational news, or I like to call it sanctioned official news. And those news items, when they're rolled up, they get a special banner that appears at the top of them, so you can tell that they've come from that official source. Just a way to visually identify that they're different to other news items that are coming through. Another thing that was, the first I heard of it has been at this conference, and it was to do with the news, but I have since heard it in other areas, and that's the concept of audience targeting. Now, audience targeting is a concept that we had in classic SharePoint. It was introduced, we had it in the full version of SharePoint 2007. And it's the concept of being able to compile or bring together groups of people based on some properties. Often that was based off your Active Directory. So it might have been on their organisational unit or their job title or some skill set that they possessed. You could bring these group of people together and then drive certain information to them, or drive navigation to them, or drive something to them that was going to personalise the SharePoint experience for that specific audience. So it looks like Microsoft is bringing that back, and news is going to be one of the first things that supports it. So we didn't see too much behind the scenes as to how that audience targeting is going to be configured and what options it's going to provide, but it's definitely coming back in some form. And we got some new layout options as well for news. So before the conference, under modern news, we had a couple of layouts. There was sort of just a list with thumbnails, and there was sort of a grid view that we had. But up on there on the slides at the moment, we're seeing a page that is showing two different layouts for your news. It's showing the carousel, which is the picture of the lady at the top of the screen. That's a news web part, showing as a carousel. So you can see there's the little carousel dots underneath that top picture. That's allowing the user to scroll through the different news items that web part is showing. And in the bottom part of the screen where it says highlights, we've got a picture of two dudes there flying a drone, and then three news items next to it. That's what's called a top story layout, where you have one piece of news is showing larger, and then you have a list of the others beside it. And as you can see, I've brought up how that news web part's configured. We get to select where the source comes from, and that's where we can do roll-ups or just to the specific site. And also you can see there how we can select between the different layouts. And within each of those layouts, there's a few different knobs, dials, things we can switch on and off, and a few options for customising it. Okay, we've got three new web parts which were all around personalisation. So we got a My Recent Sites, My Recent Documents, and My Recent News. I'll just point out there, because we didn't see it on the previous screen, that organisational news, how I said it would present differently. I can see there that the top item and the bottom item, they've both got a dark banner on the top of them. That says News at Contoso.
Sorry, just about the news web part. For the external links, does it mean that then you can mix internal news and external news in the same web part carousel, for example, or is it like separated?
So the question there was, does that external links mean that we can mix the news all together in the same list? It does. I've seen it demonstrated that they definitely come through in the same list. And the second part to that question, does that mean that we can show them on the carousel? I didn't specifically see it demonstrated on the carousel. It would be great if it did, but obviously with a carousel, and especially the size of the carousel that we were seeing there, for external news, how would we have that much control over the images, and would they always show nice would be my concern. Yeah, but as we could see from the layout options there, it would have to be making that choice dynamically, saying, oh, this one's external news and I'm showing as a carousel, so I'm not going to show it, because there was nothing I could see in the configuration options that would preclude it or say don't show external news, because you just pointed at the sources of the news, and then you say, hey, what I want the layout to be.
And you can aggregate multiple external sources? Or is it just like one?
Correct. So your external sources are specific news items. So can it aggregate different sources? Yes, because the way that you create them is you have a news repository, like a news library or a news web part inside one of your sites. When you create an external link, you are creating one news item inside of your SharePoint site, and you are just providing it with the URL. So it's not like you're hooking it to a news repository that's out there. You're creating the links and you're choosing which ones you want to pull in, but rather than you authoring the content of that yourself, you're just bringing it in. Correct. Correct. It's done on an article by article basis.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Okay, this one got a lot of claps when it was announced. The SharePoint mega menu. This is something that a lot of people went out and got developed themselves. Up until this point in time, Microsoft's heard the feedback that we really, really need this. And I think this also plays into their strengths of the new way that they want us to perform the information architecture. So when I was talking about this flat structure that they want us to be going with now, how do we provide structure to that environment? We do it virtually, and I was saying one of the ways we can do it is through hub sites. I think the other primary way we do it is through the mega menu. This allows us to give navigation and give virtual structure. So in that example that I was giving before, where we had a team site and we wanted to move it from the finance department to the legal department, we disassociate it from one hub, we join it to another hub, and we change its position in the mega menu. We change it from the finance department, some link underneath the finance department, to being a link underneath the legal department, and virtually we've restructured how users see our site. So we're going to be seeing the mega menu both at the hub level for navigation and on the sites themselves for navigation. And it's going to support multiple levels of hierarchy all at the same time. So you don't have to have multiple flyouts. Now, they haven't provided any details, or not that I've seen at this point in time, as to how this gets configured and how much of this will be dynamic and how much of it is static. So I have a lot of questions around that as well. I'd like to hope that some of the audience targeting features, some of the security trimming, things like this will actually play a part in making this menu more personalised going forward. Site headers. So under modern SharePoint site templates, we only had one option, which is the one that you see at the top of the slide here. We're getting two new ones. They're getting called minimal and compact. And while there was no specific details on these, I went through the lookbook and I'm pretty confident that these represent the three styles. They definitely said we're getting three styles to choose from. And these seem to be the three. And I also noticed that within these three, I saw slightly different variants of them. So some with menus, some without, some had authors and links in them. So I think we'll get three layout options, but then probably we'll get some things we can toggle on and off within those three layouts as well. Another one that got some applause, the site footer, finally. They're going to let us put a site footer in. Again, this is something that a lot of people did through custom development, and site footers are an incredibly hard thing to get right and make work across all devices and all browsers. Getting something to stick at the bottom of a page without jumping around everywhere isn't an easy thing to do. So Microsoft's going to give that to us out of the box, which is awesome. Page title regions. So the titles we were talking about before was the one that goes right across the top, which is your site banner, which is always visible. This page title region, here we're talking about when you're going in and you're authoring content pages within your site. So more your publishing and content publishing sites. So we've got 4 layout options available to us. And again, this is really just Microsoft's vision of trying to make SharePoint beautiful. So they've given us some flexibility here. They've given us some layouts, and they've given us multiple options within the layout. So this one, for example, they're calling this the color block. The color block is that green block that's being overlaid behind the background image. We can show it on the left or we can show it on the right. And there's multiple pieces of information. So there's a little box at the top of it. Then there's the text in the middle, and then there's some information about the author and the date published and things like that. Now we can switch these boxes on or off, so you can move them around a little bit, but they're not giving us total design control to move all this stuff around. So in some ways it's limiting, but in some ways it's good as well, in that it's providing consistency. So you can let your page authors go, and you know that all the pages are going to have some level of consistency to them, because they're all going to adhere more or less to certain templates that Microsoft is giving us. So they're certainly giving us more options, but it's not a free-for-all. The next thing, quite a simple one, but this one is quite effective. I wasn't appreciative of how effective this was when I read it as a line item until I actually saw it in action. And that is, as we're composing these web pages and putting them together, we're dragging and dropping web parts on basically to create our content. We're dragging on an image web part, like a rich text WYSIWYG editor. We're dragging in like document library web parts, all this sort of stuff. But we can also break the page up into sections, and we can put those web parts into sections and columns. Microsoft has given us the ability simply to change the background color behind one of those sections. And as you're scrolling down these web pages, it's actually really effective, and you can see it on the screen there at the moment, just to be able to delineate the sections really clearly, that this is the end of one section, one piece of information. We're changing topic here, or we're changing the information that we're trying to present and putting a border around it. This is one thing that we had in Classic and it's now coming to Modern, and that's the concept of a page design. So again, as you're authoring these pages, you're laying them out, you might be separating them into columns, different sections, and you're dragging and dropping web parts and images on. You can basically just save it as a page design so that you can come back and rather than starting blank each time, you can just start from one of your existing saved page designs. There's two parts in the page editing experience where we're working with images. The first is in the page title. So where we saw that colour block title and there was an image of, I think it was 3 or 4 guys walking along in the park having a great time, big smiles on their face. You'd upload an image in there, obviously. They're places you have control over the images. And the other place is when you're composing the page and you're dragging and dropping your web parts on, one of those is the image web part. Now, the dialogue that I'm presenting on the slide here is what happens when you try to select an image in one of those two places. Now, you've got the usual options of go and look for it on the internet, upload it, you've already provided a link. But one of the options, the new options that's in there is one called Your Organisation. Now, at an administrative level, you can designate a library as being your central asset library, and that then shows up as your organisation whenever users are trying to author things and they're looking for sources of images. So my take on this is where you would put all your official company logos, company branding, all that sort of stuff, so users can find it easily. Click on your organisation, they're all sitting there. And that should also mean that when you need to do company rebrands and things like that, you might be able to just revision the images that are in there and they'll pick them up and follow through. So just a nice, easy way to keep things controlled. I think this has got to be one of my favourites. The quick links web part, probably the most simple web part SharePoint's got. This one started out life as just giving you a way to simply put some HTML, some hyperlinks on there, whether it be providing navigation elsewhere on the site, into other sites, off to external web pages. That's its primary purpose. But what they've done is they've really given it some UI love. They've given us a whole heap of different layout options for it. They've given us the ability to use images with our quick links as well. So they could be photos that we upload, and I'll show you in some of these layout options. We can actually have quite big boxes, and you could think of that. Sometimes you go to a website and they might be different departments in the company that are all laid out in a nice, like 4 of them all next to each other. And they might have photos of, like if it was construction, you might have, you know, a bulldozer here and it says construction, that'll take you off to a construction site, and medical might have a stethoscope there, some nice images, but really they're just hyperlinks. So that is all possible with the new quick links web part. But one of the things I love the most is that you can show no image, you can upload your own image, or you can say that I want to use an icon. And when you say that I want to use an icon, you get to pick from all the icons that are available in the Office UI fabric. Now that's growing all the time, but the reasons I love it is it's awesome because they look good, they scale well. If anyone's ever used Fontastic, the way that those icons are, they're like vector images, and it's actually a font that you're using, so you can change the color of them, you can scale them well. That's pretty much how the Office UI Fabric icons work as well. So not only do they look good and scale well, but they're also the same icon library that Microsoft is now using across all of its products. And as I said in that presentation, or that video I showed at the start, is these icons aren't just being used in SharePoint, they're being used across Microsoft, because we've now got that one design sort of ethos that Microsoft's trying to drive across everywhere. So these icons are going to look good and fit in with the rest of the experiences. So this is something that's rolling out into tenants now. It's almost reached 100% saturation. So if you're playing with SharePoint, you should be able to go in and play with these now. This is quick links that I set up. So what I'm going to present here, it's the same 6 links, just shown with the different layout options. So as you can see now, we've got a title, but we can also show a description with our links. And I'm just showing the icons which are from that Office UI fabric. So here we have it without sort of the blocky look to it. I think this one might have been called the button look. This one sort of showing the image or the icon off to the left, all blocky with just the title but no descriptions. This is one that I could see could work well if you're uploading a photo, rather than, doesn't work so well with icons, but you can imagine if those were the photos that were coming up in the background, and those 3 dots underneath it, it's actually showing them as a carousel. So it'd be similar to like how that news was getting presented to us, a very similar concept. And this is just a big sort of blocky, I think this one's called tile, and there was 3 different tile sizes. I think that might be medium, you can get an even bigger one than that. Some other announcements around these type of sites was a countdown timer web part, which you can see on the slide there. I guess it's more than just the simple time that it's counting down. That's giving obviously I haven't seen the configuration of it, but obviously there must be the concept of putting a title in there and some text and a link and some other things. So a countdown timer. And probably the other thing that has been asked for quite some time, well, ever since Microsoft has been making this move from classic to modern, they gave us this modern communication site and the modern team site. But in the SharePoint world, let me just step back to the problem at hand. The problem at hand is that when you stand up your own SharePoint server or your SharePoint tenant, you get one site collection that is called your root site collection. Now for most people this concept is easier to grasp when you talk about standing up your own server because you have control over the URL. You might stand up a server and let's just say it's called My SharePoint Server. Your root site collection exists on that URL, My SharePoint Server. If you want to create any other site collections, they all appear under My SharePoint Server /sites/ the name of the site collection. So although conceptually all your site collections sit at the same level, there is kind of one that is more, it exists at the base URL of the server itself. And it's the same concept when you have your tenant, your Office 365 tenant. You have one SharePoint site that's sitting at this root, and we call that the root site collection. Now Microsoft's brought out these communication sites, and a communication site is the perfect candidate for your root site collection because that's what everyone was putting at their root site collection because you wanted navigation, you wanted high-level communication. It wasn't going to be a heavy, document-heavy site where all these document libraries and working documents were. It's always a navigation, a welcome, here's what we're all about, and navigation into the rest of your SharePoint environment. But what we haven't been able to do is actually make that root site collection use the communication site. And what Microsoft announced is that going forward, that actually will be the default. New tenants will be provisioned with the communication site by default. And retrospectively, they're saying that we're going to be able to retrospectively put a communication site in the root site collection. Now, I'm not sure how that's going to work, because if you've already got a site sitting there and it's based off like a team site or something, I'm not sure how we're going to be able to retrospectively do it. They sort of glossed over that, but they've said that that's definitely going to be a possibility. Okay, so that's it for the collaboration. That's it, sorry, not the collaboration, for the communication sites, which is all the web content authoring and the pages. And now we're going to move into the team sites, which is more around the collaboration, the teamwork, more the document libraries, the metadata, all that sort of goodness. So let's get in there and talk about those. First one I thought was amazing. I hadn't even heard any inklings of this one coming along, and I just thought this from an actual business end user perspective, this one's great, which is being able to create a SharePoint list from an Excel file. Now, most people I know, it always starts out the same way. You're creating a list, you start out writing it on a piece of paper, and then it gets too long, you think, really, I should be putting this on the computer, so they open Excel and they start their list in Excel, and then it gets to the point where they need to share it with somebody else, and then it comes time to put it into SharePoint. Well, now you can simply go into SharePoint and say, I want to create a new list, give it the file, and this is what it'll do. It'll look at your worksheet, and it'll look at your columns that you've created in your worksheet, and it will create the column in SharePoint with the title that you've given it in the Excel document, and it will take the type. So you know how you can select your column in SharePoint and say this is a date, or format this is a date. Most of them are general by default, but this one's a currency to 2 decimal places and all your different columns. It will take those, create the right column type with the right precision, all that sort of stuff, create it in SharePoint for you, and then put all of your data in. So 2 clicks, where's your file, go, and now all your data is sitting there in SharePoint, and you've managed to move that to where it should be. So I thought that was really, really cool. And the other thing that they gave us the ability to do around list creation was to create a list from an existing list. And that's the visual that I've got up there on the slide. Now this is something that we could pretty much already do in Classic, in that we could take an existing template and we could say we wanted to save it take an existing list and save it as a template. And that would go into a gallery, which was sort of a behind the scenes area where you could save these templates. And then when you went to provision a new list, you could use those templates that were sitting in the gallery. Well, this really just eliminates those galleries and just says, well, if you want to create a new list and base it off an existing one, just select it. And you're not going to have those artifacts lying around. I suspect it's probably twofold because we're seeing that these sites are all now existing up at this highest level. This is also these problems that I was talking about in the start, in that we're running out of spaces to put these galleries of templates and things like that. Because we've got this flat structure, the reuse of storing things in the site collection level isn't as useful as it once was. And that's where we're starting to see Microsoft, as I say, going forward. They're looking at using your central SharePoint admin site as being a container for these reusable elements. We've also got the potential now in modern SharePoint to have Webparts communicate with each other. This is something that we had in Classic and that's now starting to flow through into Modern. Not only do they announce this, and they've told us, which I'll go through in a second, which Webparts are going to support it straight away, but they also announced that when developing custom Webparts, this will have the same inter-Webpart communication framework available to us. So we can develop custom Webparts that can talk to each other or talk to Microsoft's first-party Webparts as well. So it's exactly the same model, if you're familiar with it, from Classic SharePoint, in that some Webparts are providers and some Webparts are consumers. So a provider is something like we see on the screen there. We see on the left-hand side, we've got the documents library. That's a provider. It's basically every time you change the selection in that, it's providing what's selected. It's saying, hey, selection's changed. Hey, selection's changed. And other Webparts on that page can be listening for those events. So when it shouts out that something's changed, they can be listening and they can consume it. What they choose to do with it will be down to the implementation of the Webpart, but what we're seeing on the slide there is on the right-hand side, we have the file viewer Webpart. So it's connected to the documents Webpart, which is the provider, and it's the consumer. So when you select a document, the file viewer is providing a view of that file. It's loading that file in so you can see it. So those two Webparts are communicating together. And Microsoft is saying when they launch this, initially there will be one provider, which will be lists, which are document libraries are based off lists. So it'll be a list and document library as our single provider. And our three consumers will be the list properties, which will show you sort of all the metadata for the item that's selected, the file viewer, which is what you're seeing there on the screen, and an embed Webpart as well, which I imagine would be providing URLs from the provider across to the consumer in that case. We're getting a new column type called a location column. Now this is quite a nifty one. I can see the potential of this one as being a real time saver. If we think about the way that we have traditionally prompted users to enter an address, you think about websites where you've got to enter your address into it. You're typically having to put in like your street address. Sometimes you're even forced to put the number in separately. So in the worst case, it'll be something like street number, street name, suburb, city, state, postcode, country, and you've got to input all those pieces of information. Now when you jump into your car and you go to use your phone and there's GPS to take you somewhere, like if we wanted to come here today to SSW, I got into my car, I fired up Google Maps and I typed in SSW Sydney and hit go. Now he knew exactly where I was going. He could probably give me the GPS coordinates of where I'm standing right now, but I didn't have to pump all this individual data in. The world has moved on and we're smart enough. The artificial intelligence and the data that's in some of these systems is powerful enough to know or infer the locations that we mean and provide all those extra details for us. So I know some of you guys are developers. You would know the reasons that we are asking for that individual split out data on forms when we're collecting it is so that we can store it nicely in databases, and then from a reporting purpose we can show all of our customers that are in a certain suburb, how many people are in this state, and split them up by country and do all this sort of nice work. Well, let's have a look at this location column in SharePoint and what they're doing. All of that's still possible, but we're just providing one entry point in. Now, I apologise, this stuff hasn't hit any tenancies that I can actually see and give you guys a demo of, nor could I create screenshots because I don't have it, so this has come out of the lookbook. But what we're seeing on the screen, yes, you can see my mouse cursor coming up. So there's a column here called college. Now what I believe is that is the only field, the only input field that a user is being asked for. And the entries that are in there are Boston College, Stanford University, and University of Oxford. I believe that that's what the user would be inputting. Now it would be nice, I'm dreaming here because I haven't seen it live in action, but I would like to think that that would work something like a taxonomy lookup field or something like that, where this is all based by Bing mapping data. if we were typing in the name of a location and it didn't uniquely, it wasn't confident that it could find the match, I would hope that it would bring back like 3 or 4 suggestions and get us to select one. So we know that we're getting the right one. But after the input's been selected, I believe that would be it for the user. They would just be selecting the location. Now the column we see after this, so this column's name was college. This column next to it is called college:city. Now I believe that would just be us choosing to display the city facet of that address. And I believe we would probably also get the city, the state, potentially even GPS coordinates and things like that. I'm not sure what Microsoft's going to provide on this field. But this concept I've seen before, and you guys might have seen before, is you're looking up data in SharePoint and you've got a lookup list, you can bring back other facets from that list, other display properties from that list, and that's exactly how they display it. So that's why I'm pretty confident that that's how this location field is going to work. If you had very keen eyes and a good memory, that very first video that I played through, it actually showed some of the UI, and one of the UIs they had was in Excel, and they had a whole column of locations and some maps next to it. Very similar to how it's operating here, is you can now have cells in Excel which you can format as locations, and it will work in what appears to me to be the same sort of way. You just punch in an address or a location, and it stores it physically in the back end as a full location that you can drill down on and do this sort of work with. So it's pretty cool. Sticking with document libraries and metadata, we're going to talk about view formatting. Now this isn't necessarily something that's brand new, but it's probably something that not a lot of people have used. So I'm just going to sort of walk back over the state of play as to where we're at before I go into the new announcements. So what you're seeing there in the top image on that slide is a standard SharePoint view. That's without any sort of customization or playing around, that's what a SharePoint view would look like. Now, there was a few things that Microsoft allowed us to do around view formatting. One of those was called column formatting, and that was done via JSON. So what you could do is you could change or format a column, and things like change its background, maybe change background or change the text or highlight the text based on, and you could base it on the information that was in the columns as well. But you had to know the cryptic JSON for interacting with the columns. And the way that you got that into SharePoint was that where you configure the view, you go in, you edit the view, and there was a spot in there you could paste this JSON in and save it. So the development story wasn't great there for your DevOps pipeline, if that's what you were trying to do. So it was more pitched as an end user feature, but which end user knows JSON? And I don't even know what the formatting of that stuff looks like. There must be something you've got to adhere to make this stuff work. What language are we working with in there and things like that. So it was a bit cryptic. They also extended that to allow you to do row and full view formatting as well by pasting just swabs of JSON into the view settings. What that would allow you to do though would present that same view. So the view that we're seeing at the top and the view at the bottom are exactly the same SharePoint view, just with this custom formatting applied to it. So they allowed us to do powerful things, but you really had to be a developer to do it, and you were really doing development in the front end as a user, so it just didn't quite feel right. One of the things that they announced at Ignite was the ability for end users to start doing similar things, start formatting columns, but to do it with a no-code solution. So what they presented on the screen here, it's actually not a great presentation that they gave because they're all those start dates are highlighted in the same color. But what it shows there on the right-hand side where they're configuring it is that based on whether the start date is present day, well, if it's before today, if it's on today, or after today, they can set different colors for how that start date shows up. Now, if you look at the column next to it being the event type, I can see that they've managed to highlight live entertainment in there as well. So not only is this specific to dates, but there must be, based on your column type, there must be different options in there. And you could say, I want to format it based on the fact that matched live entertainment was the event type that has been selected in that column. So I'd say we're going to see some different configuration options based on the different column types that we've got in SharePoint. But the fact that they're allowing us to do that end user without involving a developer is great. Heading in the right direction. Some other announcements around views and document libraries and things like that were around the size of items that we can store in a document library and still keep our viewing good. Now this all started out with basically in your SharePoint lists and libraries, it used to be pagination. We'd see you get presented with 30 items and you could go next, 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 and they'd be pages. You could view them and sort them, but you really were restricted to a small number of items and you were paging through them. The next iteration of that was to give us the infinite scroller, where we'd constantly load as the views scrolled down, but we still had to be careful of our indexing. Microsoft was starting to do predictive indexing, but you still had to be careful and you'd still hit thresholds and things like that. Well, now Microsoft has made the statement that you should not, their predictive view indexing will take care of your lists and libraries at least until they hit 30 million items, no matter how you group it, sort it, or filter on it, and it'll keep it responsive. So we'll see when the feature hits as to what the reality of that is, but that's what they've come out and told us. Other interesting tidbits that I think will be really useful is they're going to allow us to change the column width for views and to actually persist that column width. Super annoying if you're going back to the same view over and over again and having to resize it. A really simple thing, but it was super effective when it was demonstrated, is with this infinite scroller when you've got your large lists. Currently what happens is as soon as you scroll past the first list, the first sort of visible set of items, is the headers scroll off the page as well. Well, now they'll actually stick. So right underneath your site banner, the headers go up and they just stick to it. And as you scroll, you can see what your columns are. All your headers are stuck there. We also get a footer at the bottom of your list and libraries as well, and it can provide totals for your numbers columns. Now there were some caveats that they mentioned around that there are some performance issues that they're trying to iron out, and whether they can fully iron those out, I don't know, because you can imagine giving the users the ability to do grouping and filtering within a view. Combine that with the first item they've announced there, that they'll allow up to 30 million items in there, and how they're going to do dynamic calculations on that volume of items on screen and allow filtering and grouping. We may find that those two sort of never really go hand in hand. You're going to have a trade-off there. But it's not on by default. It's something you can switch on when you're configuring things. Search. There was a lot announced around search. And Microsoft's really heading in the right direction. I have got a short video I want to play you on search. But first of all, I wanted to talk through sort of what the major things were so you can keep an eye out for them when we come to play the video. Now, I really like the vision on this one, and the vision is that a user should be able to go to one place to search for information. I should just be able, no matter what I'm looking for, I should be able to punch it into the search and get a result that I'm after. Now, currently, that is not the world that we're living in. Currently, I might have sent a piece of information, or had a conversation, and I've had it with Bob. At the moment, I've got to think, what did I send that to Bob in? Because if I send it to him in Yammer, I've got to go to Yammer to search. If it was a Teams conversation that I send it to him with, I'm going to have to go to Teams. If it was an email, well, I could search email, or my email is indexed in SharePoint, so I could go to SharePoint search and find it there. If it's in SharePoint, then I've got to go to SharePoint. Or it could even just be a piece of information that's out on the internet. At the moment, you've got to know whether, is that information that I'm looking for, it might be a procedure or how to do something or how to get past a problem that I'm working on. At the moment, have I got that skill set inside of my organisation? If I have, maybe I'll search SharePoint because someone inside of our organisation might know. And if they don't, then I'll go out and search the web. It's not this place at the moment. The world is not a place where I can just go into one search location and search everything. Microsoft's vision is that you should be able to. As a user, you should be able to go to one place and you should be able to find anything that you're looking for. And I think that is a great vision to have. But more than that, and this is where it's changed vastly, and it sort of caught me off guard, but they've definitely onto the right thing here, is you shouldn't have to go to one place to start your search. So what Microsoft did in the past in SharePoint is we had the Microsoft Search Center, which was the big panacea of I want to find something, I'll go to the big search center. So I'll stop what I'm doing, I'll go over here to the search center, and I'll do my search over there. And as time has passed, we've found that the thing only searches SharePoint. We've now got all these other things, which is the other part of the problem. But what Microsoft is, the vision that they've got is that they want to provide you with a consistent, unified search, like a search bar, a search control, but in all the products. So whether it be Cortana, Bing, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, SharePoint mobile app, OneDrive, they want the search bar to look the same, function the same, give you exactly the same results. So you might be in Word and I want to search for Bob Smith. If I type Bob Smith, I want to see his person card come up and have all that experience that I would have if I went into sort of SharePoint and found it. If I went to like with my contacts and found it in Windows 10. So the idea is wherever I search, I should be getting the same consistent results. But that search should also be available to me wherever I am. I don't have to go to find it. So I think those two things, their vision, they've got it right. In my opinion, they've got it right. And if they can deliver on that, then I think that will be an awesome experience for the user. And we'll see, we see very clearly at the start of this video, you'll see that the actual search control, now that they're using the same unified design as we saw in the first video across all of their products, this control, we've been told, is a common control. It's physically, technically, a common control across their products, and they've been able to implement it. So not only are we're getting the same feel, but it is actually the same component. There is one slight caveat to that: you will always get the same results, but in a good way. So maybe I shouldn't call it a caveat. On the slide, we're looking at, this is PowerPoint, and the user's typed in a couple of characters to do a search. The very first section of search results that come back are actually help within PowerPoint. So they're giving me actions within PowerPoint. So if you can't find functionality that you're looking for in the ribbon, you just start typing it into the search bar and it'll suggest, oh, here's actions you can perform inside of PowerPoint. And there'll be help inside of PowerPoint there as well. I think the Office applications already have this concept up in their taskbar at the moment. That's their helps, the way their help system works. But if you think about it, that goes back to Microsoft's vision in that I want to know how to do something, I should just be able to type it into the search bar. If the product knows how to do it itself, it's going to respond to me. If the product doesn't know, what I'll also see in that drop down is if the product doesn't know and other people in my organisation don't know, I'll start seeing public search results, and I might see a blog post of someone telling me how to do that inside of PowerPoint, which is probably where most people would end up if they couldn't, you know, they're banging their head against the wall and they can't figure out how to do it. They'd go off to a web browser and do a web search and try and find someone that's instructing them how to do it. Well, this is a perfect example of why it works, is that we're now having a search across the product's own internal help and its own sort of helping and assistance, and we're doing a search across our entire organisation and across public search resources as well, all from that one search experience. And Microsoft also announced two big things here is that Teams and Yammer are all going to be included inside of that search index as well, so no longer are they hidden and siloed away. And also that if you have federated your tenancy with Office 365 inside of the Bing search experience, so if you've opened up the Bing website and you're authenticated on your machine, your search results inside of Bing will also include stuff coming from your organisation. So if you're searching for somebody's name, you'll actually see their people cards. You'll see stuff coming from the graph, documents that they've worked on. You'll see documents coming from SharePoint, actual sites and applications and things like that that are hosted internally on your Office 365 tenant will be surfaced actually in the Bing public web page. And we'll see some of that in the video. So I'm going to roll that and keep an eye out for some of those things that I've been talking about. Okay. There's one thing that I really liked in that video that brought it home to me. It was when the lady was walking across the road and she was on a mobile phone and she had a web browser open and she had Bing open and she typed into that Bing search bar, book time off. And the result that came back was an internal Contoso booking application. So public website, just typed in what she wanted to do and she was brought back into an internal system within her organisation to achieve it. So it really brings home the concept that the user shouldn't care where they do their search from or what they're searching for. They should just be able to find what they're after. So really, really awesome. Some other things that Microsoft announced, which I thought was really cool, that was the artificial intelligent transcription service that they have. So this is up in the cloud, and if you upload your audio or video to Microsoft Stream, which is Microsoft's video hosting service up inside of Office 365 and Azure, so it hosts your videos and makes sure that they're discoverable and they're encoded for all the different mobile devices and those sort of things. That's called Microsoft Stream. Any audio or video that's uploaded into that service gets run through this transcription service. So basically it looks at the audio, looks at the video, and it gives you the text. So everything that's said in that video, and you can read it. It's all sort of written down, but that's then indexed and provided for search. It goes further than that in that it uses face recognition for all the people that it knows about, and it will tag. So if we had my character Bob that I like to talk about, if he popped his head into this video that we're recording, we upload this to Microsoft Stream, it will know that if we do a search for Bob, it'll know that Bob was in this video. But more than that, when it's doing this transcription service and when it's doing its facial recognition and tagging people being in videos, is it also knows exactly when every word was said. And it knows when Bob's face popped into this video. So if we typed in Bob and we typed in search and stuff like that, so we would get a hit on this video, if we actually went to play that video, it would start the video at the exact time that Bob's head popped into the video. And if we were to also search for some of the keywords about what I'm talking about now, about search, about like indexing, about transcription services, it would find this video, and when we went to play it, it would take us to this exact moment within this video. So really, really powerful how it's indexing video streams, because video is getting more and more popular as within enterprises as ways to convey messages, as ways to do training, and being able to find a video is one thing, but when you find a video and it's an hour long, and trying to find exactly what you're looking for in the video then becomes the challenge, and a lot of the time it's just all too hard. So allowing search to work at that minute level within the video is really, really powerful. The other thing that you get when you upload photos into OneDrive and Office 365 and SharePoint is that they go through AI, artificial intelligence classification as well. Similar to you might be used to in the consumer world where you upload photos to services and it'll say, well, there's a beach in this photo, there's a dog in that one, and it's classifying objects that it knows about. Office 365 will do that for us as well. And it'll also do optical character recognition on any text that it finds in photos as well. So if you're, as part of your organisation, you've got people out taking photos of signs and buildings and all that sort of stuff, then those company names and the messages on the signs, that all becomes available for search as well. Okay, the SharePoint mobile app. This has been available on iPhone and Android for quite some time now, but it's been given a bit of an overhaul. Probably the biggest one, and probably my biggest gripe with the SharePoint mobile app, is that it was really good on those communication sites. So where you're authoring, doing the publishing, the content publishing. It was really good, and you could browse through your sites and you could read the content that was on it. It was really good at that. Where I felt it let us down was as soon as you went into the team sites and you went to a document library, it would actually throw you out of the SharePoint mobile app and it would launch the OneDrive app. And so your navigation of libraries was actually done in the OneDrive app, not in the SharePoint app. And what you're seeing on the screen there at the moment is a document library being navigated, but still within the SharePoint app. Now, Microsoft have said that you will still need to go to OneDrive, or you will get switched to OneDrive for richer actions. That's their terminology, not mine. I don't know exactly what that means. I would hope that we could launch the files and maybe even see a preview of them without getting launched out into OneDrive, but remains to be seen exactly what that means. News, there was a few updates with the news. The news is one of the tabs within your SharePoint app, so you can consume your news. And the official organisational news comes through as well. So you get the little banner, the last 2 news items on that right image on that slide, that says News at Contoso above them to show you that it is that organisational news. But probably the most useful one is those external news links that we were speaking about earlier. You can create those on your mobile device. And so you could be out on a, browsing the web, you find a news article that's relevant to your organisation, you could create the news item directly off your mobile device. Because you're not authoring the content and it really is just a link and maybe some metadata around it, perfect use case for enabling that on the mobile app. There was also the ability to comment on news items and @mention people as well, directly from within the SharePoint mobile app. There was a brand new app launched, which is the Stream mobile app. So we've talked about Stream being the video service up in Office 365. The mobile app is essentially your mobile video player, and it has the capability to take video offline as well. Lots of announcements around OneDrive. A lot of it centered around the enhancements for Mac. Now, a lot of that was just bringing Mac up to speed with where we were on Windows. So not too long ago, we had this segregation of, there was 2 OneDrive sync clients. There's one for the consumer world and there was one for OneDrive for business. Those were brought together a little while ago on a Windows-based PC. It was one consolidated sync client. Mac, that same consolidation has now been announced for Mac, and that's one of the big things for Mac that was announced at the conference. Also, Files on Demand is supported on Mac now as well. So Files on Demand, if you haven't used it, that is the ability for you to see all of your files and all of the structure. So you could be storing a wealth of information up in Office 365 in your document libraries. And when you're looking at those through OneDrive, so through your Windows Explorer on your desktop, and you'll be able to see the full folder structure. You can see every file that's up there, but none of those files have to reside on your PC. When you try to use them, you double click on it to try to open it, it will pull it down on demand, hence the name Files on Demand. You can select whole folders or individual files that you say always keep this synced on my machine, but by default you will see all the files and you see little icons next to them, so it shows you which ones are in the cloud, which ones are on your machine, which ones are syncing, all that sort of stuff. So we already had that on the PC, and all of that was announced for the Mac as well. On the Windows PC, we have, well, in Windows 10, not just on a PC, but it has to be inside of Windows 10, we have something that's called Storage Sense. Now this is the part of Windows 10 that looks after or manages how much space you've got left on your drives, and sort of frees up space when you're getting close to full. It's the little notification that comes up in the bottom and says, hey, you need to free up some space and I'll offer to help you. Well, they've built in some logic specifically around the OneDrive sync client. So as you're pulling these files off, or bringing them down and storing them locally, it's obviously going to consume space on your drive. You get to the point where you're starting to run out of room. Storage Sense is now tracking, with the help of the OneDrive sync client, what files has OneDrive brought down from the cloud that you haven't accessed in a long time. It knows exactly when you last accessed those files, and it'll start freeing them up from the ones that are least used or have been used the oldest. So it's an intelligent way of keeping your machine within its storage capacity. Another thing that was announced was the ability to use that OneDrive sync against multiple Office 365 tenants. So up until this point in time, you've got your corporate Office 365 tenant, you've got your sync client, the two talk together, and you've got that experience. Fantastic. Another organisation, especially if you're a consultant or you're in partnership with other organisations, they may have granted you access to some of their sites, some information, maybe just some individual documents. What they've announced is that you are now going to be able to sync with that tenant at the same time that you're syncing with your tenant. Now, I've asked the question, I'm waiting for a response back from the OneDrive product team as to whether that is going to also allow different sets of credentials, or if it's only going to, or different identities, or if it's just going to be one identity that's accessed in multiple tenants. So what I mean by that is that in that first scenario, I was very careful with the way I chose my words. I said that you've got your own corporate tenant, and I said that you're working with an additional party and they've shared their content with you, with your identity. Now, I can do that. Usually that's just based on your email address. So Dwyer at oneplacesolutions.com. I've got my tenancy. A partner of mine wants to share something with me. They choose to share it and they use my corporate email address. Because we're all in Office 365, it's going to let me in and it knows who I am. The other way that some organisations would work is that in their tenancy, maybe it's Contoso, they would create a guest user for me, if you like. They would create a Dwyer at contoso.com and they'd say, here, we've given you some access and here's the username and password you can use to access it. Now, even though that's Microsoft credentials, I don't believe that this cross-org sync would allow me to plug in multiple sets of credentials like that, multiple identities. I believe it's one identity with access to multiple tenants. But I have asked a question of the OneDrive team to see whether that is something that they're looking at or something that they may have already considered and might be supporting out of the box. On the mobile devices, being iPhone and Android, we now have the ability to back up the photos that are taken on the native camera applications there. So, so your camera roll on an iPhone, for instance, you can choose to use OneDrive for Business as your default backup mechanism. So any photo that you take is automatically and in the background streamed up to OneDrive for Business. You get to choose the library that you want it to go into. So in an enterprise scenario, if you've got people out in the field that are responsible for taking photos of equipment and things like that, then as soon as they take the photos, it's going to be streamed automatically in the background up to the designated locations in OneDrive for Business. We also have metadata capture. So in the OneDrive for Business app, when you take a photo and you choose to save it to a SharePoint location, you'll get some basic metadata entry, which you're seeing in the bottom right-hand corner there in that save dialog. So being able to do some metadata capture, or some metadata entry at the point of capture. Moving on to Microsoft Teams and the integration that was announced between SharePoint and Teams. Firstly, we're still living in this hybrid sort of catch-up world where we had the concept of team sites in SharePoint. People have been using them for many, many years, and we could create team sites. And then Microsoft Teams came out as a product. And the whole concept of Microsoft Teams was the fact that you're doing teamwork, you're doing collaboration. And what we see now when you provision a team is a SharePoint team site gets provisioned for it. You get a few different workloads provisioned, you get calendars, you get a planner, you get the SharePoint site that's created. But where we're left, because of the legacy and where we've come from, is there's a lot of team sites in SharePoint that were created before Microsoft Teams existed. So Microsoft's giving us a way of retrospectively going back and provisioning the Microsoft team along with the SharePoint team site that already existed and make that association. And they're doing that simply by, they know which team sites, well when you go to a team site they know if there's not a team behind it, and they're giving us a way on the user interface of the team site to go back and retrospectively create that team and wire it all up. For those that have done much work with Microsoft Teams, you might have noticed that it uses SharePoint as its file storage mechanism. So when you're doing chats in Teams and you're uploading things into a Teams channels and you're discussing it with your colleagues, that is actually storing those files in the SharePoint document library for the team. Each of the channels, so inside of your Teams client, you've got the concept of Teams, and within Teams you have channels. And channels is like your different topics of conversation. Well, every time a new one of those channels is created, it creates a folder of the same name in your SharePoint document library. And then when you're uploading photos in your Teams client or you're doing images and Word documents and things like that, it's storing them in those folders inside of SharePoint. Now you can go to that SharePoint team site and you can go to that document library and you can go into those folders, and they are just, from the SharePoint side of things, that's just a document library and they're just folders and they're just files. There's nothing stopping you from going in there, renaming folders, deleting things and really mucking around with Teams. Now obviously that's going to cause problems. So what Microsoft's doing is they're starting to bring controls into place and visual things into place to let us know more what's going on here. So what you're seeing in this screenshot here is there's a banner inside of this document library that says this folder is connected to a channel in Microsoft Teams. And they've given us a button there that says go to channel conversations. So that would flick us over to Microsoft Teams and to the channel that's represented by this. They were also talking about, nothing demonstrated, but they were talking about that they'd be providing guidance in the user interface around deletions and renames, that should happen in Teams and not up here in SharePoint. I'm hoping that they're going to go further than guidance and they actually prevent you from doing any of that whatsoever up here, because it's going to lead to trouble. So at least they're heading in the right direction. They know the problem exists, they're trying to do something about it, and we're seeing stuff on the screen. They're being able to demonstrate stuff now. So we're getting there. Another big thing that was announced is that, well, let's take one step back first. Inside of Microsoft Teams and inside of your Teams channels, you have this concept of tabs. Now, primarily the tab that most people will be used to is the Conversations tab. That's where you see your threaded conversation and you're talking to people. But there's other tabs inside of that channel as well. If you want to share files, there is a Files tab. And there's third-party tabs that you can add, so other people can make products. We're getting the full experience now, so anything that you could do on that SharePoint page inside of SharePoint, you'll be able to do now through Teams itself. And we're going to be seeing document libraries coming through, full fidelity document libraries coming through into Teams. But we're going to be seeing a lot of stuff come through, and it's going to come through really quickly. And the reason it's going to come through really quickly is the next announcement they made, which was that if you make a web part for SharePoint, it will work inside of Teams. Because we had this development model inside of Teams, the way we could extend Teams in these tabs. Now what they announced was that they unified the development model in that any existing SharePoint web part is a Teams web part. And any web part that you design for the Teams client will work in SharePoint. It is exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same model. It's the same development model and it will just work. So what that means is any modern web part that Microsoft has designed for SharePoint, i.e. document library web part, it will come in here with full fidelity. So it's not a Teams version of it, a cut down, minimized thing, am I going to see this, am I going to see that? It is the same web part coming through. And it is the same SharePoint pages and things coming through. So really full fidelity, and I'm probably skipping ahead a bit here, but onto some of the more out there roadmap visuals of where Microsoft's trying to go. But this sort of highlights one of the things. One of the things Microsoft's got in their mind is that it shouldn't matter how you get to a piece of information, whether it be through its native application, whether it be through a search experience somewhere else, or whether it be through something like this, exposing SharePoint as a tab inside of Teams. Anywhere you manage to get to a piece of information, you should have the same rich, full fidelity experience as you would have got had you got to that same piece of information in the native product. So it's a pretty powerful sort of statement that goal they're trying to achieve there. But I think the modern web world is what's empowering them to do this. Because as you look at more and more of how they're building their applications out, how Microsoft is making their products cross-platform, a lot of it is moving all of the technologies to being sort of web-based technologies, or all being similar sort of technology stacks. And it actually plays a lot nicer into just taking components of different products and being able to embed them within other products. So it's an ambitious goal, but we're actually seeing some of it actually come to fruition and actually surface itself. So that's a really powerful one, especially for developers. It's anyone that's capable of developing SharePoint web parts is now a Teams developer as well, which is awesome. Yes?
About Teams, anything about being able to set up a different default tab within your channel? Sorry. That's a big thing for all my clients. They're always asking if you can change it from conversation to files, for example.
Yes.
And it's not possible at the moment.
There's definitely some work being done on the provisioning of Teams and on what's going to be capable of how we're going to be able to stand up Teams and how we're going to be able to configure Teams. I'm not sure if there was anything specifically announced at the conference. I'll have a chat with you after this because I could quickly find some of that information out for you. To do with the SharePoint server, this is a really quick overview of the SharePoint server. So when I talk SharePoint server, I'm now talking about the on-premises product that you can take away and install. All of the information that I've presented so far is really Office 365 functionality that's going to land, it's either rolling out now, by the end of the year, or in the first quarter of next year. That's pretty much everything that I've demonstrated here. Now, or presented here. Now for SharePoint Server on premises, so this is SharePoint Server 2019, it was announced at the conference that it was going to go GA in October, and it did in late October. so it's out now. But it had been in preview for a long, long time in the lead up to the conference. So we didn't hear any new announcements that, oh, we're going to, by the way, you've been looking at the preview for the last 4 or 5 months and hey, there's this huge new feature we're going to add to it. It was really a case of by the time this conference had rocked around, that code base was closed on 2019. It was really just doing that final testing, calling it a preview before it went GA, but there's no real new features launched inside of that. But a quick recap as to what was included in that server release is that, as I said, it's now generally available. That happened late October. You get your modern user experiences. So by modern user experiences, I mean the 2 new modern templates, being the communication site and the team site. You get, from a development perspective, you get the SharePoint framework. So you can develop SharePoint framework extensions, now supported on premises. OneDrive files on demand, that's supported against your sync clients. One new thing that did get announced was an enhancement to the SharePoint migration tool. So we did have an existing SharePoint migration tool. So this is an official one created by Microsoft, a free tool. So there's many comprehensive migration companies out there and products out there to do SharePoint server to server migrations, to on-premises to the cloud migrations. This tool is specifically for migrating from a SharePoint server to the cloud. And the previous version of the tool only allowed you to take libraries and move them to the cloud. It didn't let you take a whole site, so you had to actually create a site up there and then move the document library. The enhancement of the tool lets you take whole sites and move whole sites to the cloud. So that is about it for me deep diving into different features and showing you what they look like. The remainder of this slide deck, which I will make, it's already publicly available, but I'll make sure that you guys all have the URLs to it, is that these are slides in several of the sessions that were presented. There were roadmap slides that would give us timelines for a lot of the features that we've talked about here, but also some of those more far off things that are top of mind for Microsoft and things that they're looking at going into the future. So I've pulled out all of those that I could find, and some nice people out on the internet had also posted some, which I was able to grab. But we'll go through some of those, and I'll just call out some of the things that we haven't talked through in any detail, but I'll just mention ones that I thought were interesting or I thought are worth mentioning. So modern pages, Webparts and news, as I said, we went through a lot of this information, but here's a few that we didn't. There's some page authoring updates. So this is more around sort of when you're editing pages, so is somebody else editing the page at the same time? The concept of timeouts around when you've got to check stuff back in, so it's preventing people from checking something out and never checking it back in and preventing other people from working on it. Version history, increasing what that's capable of and how that works and what we can see. So a lot of this is bringing it up to where it was for Classic, but some of it's going beyond what we could ever do in Classic as well. We're getting some new web parts. We're getting a Yammer full feed web part. We're getting a YouTube web part. We've already talked about the countdown timer web part, and we're going to be getting a code snippet web part. There was a little bit of talk in a few different sessions about page usage data. So being able to see the views, how many people have read or viewed your pages. I saw a heat map there at one stage to show most popular pages and things within a site. I did see, I'm pretty sure it was around reading a page content. I don't think it was in Word. I think it was actually like authored ECM, a SharePoint page, was a time to read metric. So you might have seen that on some websites these days where you go in and before you read an article, it says this article is going to take you 3 minutes to read. So the reader has actually got this concept of how long an article is going to take for them to read. So you know whether, okay, I'll read this because it's going to take me 3 minutes, or this is a half-hour read. I might not embark on that right now. Site branding and designs. Again, we talked through a lot of this. I don't think I specifically called this one out, which is the ability to do a full width header. So just to have an image right across the whole width of the site with no Chrome on it at all, and transparent logos for the sites. Here's another one of those things where we're seeing settings coming up into the tenancy level, up higher than any site collection. So support for enabling select customizations on company brand settings. Now, I didn't see that mentioned in any presentations other than on this slide, so I don't know what they specifically mean by that. But obviously, when you're doing company branding, it is something you want to be doing across your entire tenancy, every site collection. So it's good that they're thinking about it. Audience targeting. So we briefly talked about audience targeting, and they're mentioning that in the context of site and hub navigation. So I don't know if that means we'll see it in the mega menu or if we'll only see it in sort of other navigational links they'll give us in the hub sites. But at least they're thinking about it. It's definitely on the right track. And again, we're seeing the site designs. So we talked about site designs, users being able to save them off. Oh no, we didn't actually. We were talking about page design before. So site design, the ability to be able to store those things up in the admin center and manage them. So again, we're talking about more management of SharePoint things happening up at a tenancy level. All right, what other interesting stuff have we got in here? Custom page metadata for modern pages, that is out now, and that has reached saturation. That's in all tenancies. So the modern pages are stored in the same way the classic ones were, in that there's a document library, a pages document library. You can simply go into that and add extra SharePoint columns to it. And then when you're viewing the page in the modern editing experience, or even when the user's reading it, you can slide out the properties panel and it will show you any of the metadata. So all those additional columns that you've selected in the document library or created in the document library, they come through into the panel, the properties panel. And you also get a properties web part. So if you're authoring your pages, you can drag and drop a web part on there which will show the properties for that page. They announced that the Microsoft Graph API is getting the capability for exposing pages. So some capability to create pages. I think there's some things in there around the web parts that are on pages, configuring those. So being able to dynamically and through code start constructing and manipulating page content. And content scheduling. I highlighted that one because it struck me as something that I would have thought it would have been in there by now. Maybe it's more advanced than what I'm thinking it is. I mean, in the past, to me, content scheduling to me means being able to put a date on a page where I want it to come live in the site, and maybe an expiry date as well where I want it to disappear again. But it's good to know that at least it's on the radar and it's coming. Hub sites. This one I found quite interesting. Again, there's no date on this one. So this one's more further out. But it's nice to know that they're thinking about hub metadata and content type support, because that is something that when we were doing information architecture and things in SharePoint environments, content types figure into that quite heavily, and the way we used to drive that down through the architecture and the different levels of sites and subsites was it's quite a task to actually do that and figure it all out. And how that's going to play out in this world of flat structure and joining and disassociating from hub sites and joining to other hub sites, it's top of mind, and they're trying to solve that and trying to figure out a way of bringing that through into the modern way of doing things. And also, they're looking at the concept of being able to nest hubs and have a site joined to two hubs. So they're looking at those two things as well. Now, they're not saying that they're going to support these. So in some cases, it might be just thinking them through and thinking that this is a bad idea. So don't take these top of mind ones as saying that we're going to see this in future. But they're thinking about it. But I can see some good reasons why some of those things with parenting sites to multiple hubs and things might be cause more problems than it does good. So they may not all come through. Teams and SharePoint integration. And these are really the points that I touched on earlier when we were looking at some of those web parts coming through into Teams, was that Microsoft's vision is really to get this full fidelity experience, no matter what application you've managed to arrive at the content through. What have we seen? ECM. So when we talk ECM, we're talking around more the team sites, the document management style stuff in here. Just calling out a few changes that did make it down to SharePoint 2019 on premises. So attention views, Microsoft changed under modern the way that it handles mandatory metadata, and rather than enforcing it, it sort of highlights it in SharePoint. You get coloured views that sort of points out to people where they've got to fill information in. So that comes down to SharePoint 2019. You get the capability to bulk edit metadata in SharePoint 2019 now. Something to be aware of if you're not from a developer point of view is the hash and the % symbol. In Office 365 up in the cloud, Microsoft made a change probably in the last 6 months where you can now use those two characters, I believe, in folder names and file names. Now those two characters are reserved characters in URLs. And if you're doing any sort of manipulation with URLs, constructing URLs, they've now provided special classes that you've got to use when you're constructing these URLs to support these two characters. Really, it was painful for us as a product company because we had to make quite significant changes to support these characters. By the end of 2018, they're talking about us seeing modernised document sets. So at the moment, document sets just aren't supported in these modern sites. I love document sets. They feature just about everything that I do in SharePoint, so they can't come soon enough as far as I'm concerned. So great that they're saying that we should be seeing them by the end of the calendar year. And another thing there, I just pointed out 3 things, but it really comes down to one thing, and that is the concept of labels. Now this plays into records management and classification of content. Now before these labels came about, when I'm talking labels here, it's actually something that's driven from Azure, and it's much wider than just SharePoint. So in the past, if we're talking about records management and like classification and retention policies and things like that, and we were talking about that in previous years, we would have been talking about that in the scope of just SharePoint, and we would have been talking about terms and taxonomy store and classifying information against those terms and then tying those to retention policies and things like that and security. Well, Microsoft has taken a wider vision on that, thankfully, because when you're talking about records management, it's much more than just SharePoint these days. We've got Yammer, we've got Teams, we've got data being stored in all sorts of other services that can form records and does form records. So they've taken the concept of labeling right down to the Azure platform level. And so in the Azure, I think it's governance and security, I think that's the area inside of Azure that it shows up in. There's sort of a portal in there. And this is also tackling things like GDPR concerns as well, and retention policies. So this is allowing us to configure labels and security and retention policies, all the sorts of things we think about when we think about records management, but do them at a wider level than just SharePoint and really wider than even Office 365, and do it in a consistent way. So if that's an area that you've worked in the past, I would strongly encourage you to take a look at where Microsoft's going with labeling. Business apps, this is where we talk about some of the newer members of the family. We talk about Power Apps, we talk about Flow, we're talking about sort of the form replacement inside of SharePoint that happens through Power Apps. One of the other things is the ability to quickly edit a SharePoint list. This is something that you could do under classic SharePoint. It's where you could see a SharePoint list with all your columns of metadata, and you could flick it into quick editing mode, and it sort of looks like an Excel spreadsheet, and you can modify all the different items all at the same time, and then you save your changes back. That's going to be coming to modern the start of next year as well, which is a great one to see. We currently have the ability to replace the editing experience of an item in SharePoint with a Power Apps form. So if you don't like the layout that SharePoint gives you, you can replace it with a Power Apps form, and then you have control over the layout of what that form looks like, and you can provide other functionality that you wouldn't get out of the box with SharePoint, how it lays out its columns. So we've been able to do that for a while. What they've announced that we'll see in 2019 is that those custom forms will also come down into the SharePoint mobile app as well. And that is it for my news in this session. A lot of the videos a lot of the sessions at Microsoft Ignite were recorded, and the URL that's on that slide there is to all the video recordings that were done. It's got a nice search interface and filters and things around it for topics that you're interested in. So go up there and visit it. As I said, I'll make my slide deck available, so if there's any of those specific features, functionality you're interested in, you can have a look on those timeline roadmap slides and see when it's coming through. And those are my details. So reach out, stay in touch, and I'd love to talk to you all more about some of these features that are coming. So thanks a lot for your time. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. Okay, was there anything about improved validation on SharePoint lists? So are we talking list on individual items within the list, or column values on the list? Is that what, like entry of metadata into the list? So validating that the columns have values or they've got specific values in them? Yes, correct. Okay, so the question is around, at the moment, using Flow to overcome or to service the need of not only validating one column of information, but being able to validate the combination of values that are stored in multiple columns, and in particular computed columns as well, and using those values. I certainly know in the past it was possible, not under the modern SharePoint, but under Classic, there was something that was called list level validation. So you could have column level validation, but there was also the concept of list level validation. And that did allow you to say that if my category is high value project and I'm not sure it was assigned to this department, or make sure it's got a project manager that's capable of, you know, handling a project of that size, you could look at one column or look at multiple columns and the values in them, and you could reject, basically approve or reject, validate, being valid or invalid, the entire SharePoint item across multiple columns. So I believe you can still do it under Classic, but under Modern I don't think that that capability exists, and I haven't seen anything under Modern that would suffice going forward. Yeah, no, I haven't seen anything in that regard. Interesting one though. It's an area I love, the whole metadata piece of it. It's where I spend a lot of my time, and I think what we've seen is in this march from Classic to Modern, they did a lot of the content authoring, the portal sort of stuff. That got a lot of love first, and I think we're only just now starting to see the whole metadata side. Really, they're starting to focus on that and bring a lot more of that across to Modern, which for me, that's what I'm really keen to see come across, and that exactly this type of functionality that we've been building systems on, and that's why I'm so keen to see document sets come across as well. So I use those as a building block for a lot of solutions. Awesome. Well, I'll call an end to it there, but I'm happy to chat after the cameras stop.